Good morning again, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the English edition of the 5th Socio-Economic Monitoring, Labour Market and Origin. Before we start the webinar, I want to note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website afterwards. Also, we will have ample time for questions and remarks after the presentations, but we won't be moderating the chat during the presentation, so any questions will have to wait until the end. And then I now gladly pass the floor to Tom Bevers, Advisor General of the Socio-Economic Studies Department at the Ministry for Employment. Tom.
Thank you, Anne, and good morning to you all, and welcome to our webinar also on my behalf. So, as Anne just said, today we present to you the 5th Socio-Economic Monitoring Report. In fact, to be honest, we already presented it last year, but today we present the English version to you. It's the second time that we publish the report in English as well, which is, I think, quite appropriate, as reports on this scale and with this depth on the basis of exhaustive administrative data are not that common, not just in Belgium, but also beyond our borders. It is also the last time that we will present this report, although that should be no reason for sadness. From next year onwards, it will be embedded in a broader report on diversity on our labour market, taking into account also gender and age, although you already find a lot about those in this report. And we will also try to integrate disability in the report. But first, of course, there is this report. And before we start presenting it to you, let me already thank all the colleagues from Unia, the Equal Opportunity Center, and from our ministry that have contributed to this report and to the different seminars and conferences where we presented it, and the Crossroads Bank for Social Security that provides us with the data without which this report would simply not exist. And with that, I will now hand over to Patrick Charlier from Unia.
Yes, thank you, Tom, and welcome to everybody. It's a pleasure for me to introduce this webinar, and I would like to thank the FPS Employment for this invitation. The core business of Unia as a equality body is equality and non-discrimination. And in that sense, we are convinced that the unexplained difference between different groups indicate the existence of a form of structural discrimination. Moreover, this is confirmed by other research. There are significant intersections between origin, gender, education, and age. And secondly, discrimination may also differ by origin. There are specific dynamics, and we launch research on a discrimination situation for Afro-descent people, for example. Our experience shows that discrimination is not only a factor in recruitment, but also happens in all phases of the employment relationship. We should also highlight the impact of discrimination in education, which has consequences for access to employment. To address these issues of systemic discrimination, Unia advocates structural measures that can have a leverage effect. Obliging employers to draw and implement a discrimination prevention plan is one of our recommendations. Secondly, to promote positive action. And thirdly, use situation tests and data mining to detect hidden discriminatory process and patterns, which are often involuntary and unconscious, not to punish, but to support change. I wish you a pleasant webinar and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and Tom, of course. So now I will start with the results of our last socio-economic monitoring. I will not present all of the results because it's a very big report, so I invite all of you to read it in detail. Afterwards, as announced in the program, we will have 2 international experts on the topics that are being looked at in the latest edition, but I will present them as well after my presentation. So our 5th socio-economic monitoring, labour market and origin. As some of you may already know, the socio-economic monitoring is actually a 2-yearly report that we have now, for the 5th time, been writing with many of the colleagues at the Federal Ministry for Labour in close cooperation with Unia. It is, to our knowledge, the greatest data collection on the position of people of different origins on the Belgian labour market. We can break these results down by many personal characteristics, thanks to the level of detail of these administrative data. We have, of course, labour market related variables like employment status, sector, their wage level, the type of contract, but we also have characteristics related to their education level, which we can look at in great detail. We have the field of study of their degree, and many more things such as migration motive or the trajectories that they followed on the labour market. Our 5th edition was actually published, as Tom said, in December 2022, but we have also developed an English translation because we received a lot of questions from international colleagues who also were interested in the Belgian results. In each edition, we look at a number of focus chapters, looking into more detail in an underdeveloped issue. And this time, this was maybe unsurprisingly the impact of COVID-19 on people of migrant origin. We have student work, grade repetition, and posted workers in Belgium. So how does this work? I will very briefly give some methodology, but most of the details are in the report themselves and in very large lines, the demographic content of the report. So this data is made available by the Crossroads Bank for Social Security, which contains administrative data for almost all social security subjects in Belgium. No, for all of them. So this means that everyone who is legally in Belgium will be in our data. And in the report, we look at the population at working age, so 18 to 64. It covers mainly the period 2008 to 2020, but the data for 2020 was not complete, and for the educational data, we also cannot go further than 2018. We have specifically for this report created 2 variables to tackle the need for a better concept than variables that only look at an individual, namely the nationality of the individual and the country of birth. What we want to capture in the report is actually someone's background, where were their parents coming from, and when possible, even the grandparents. So we have made 2 concepts looking at origin and migration background. Origin is actually defined on the current nationality of the individual, the nationality at birth, and the nationality of birth of their parents. So someone is from foreign origin if they are not Belgian themselves, they haven't acquired Belgian citizenship, they weren't born with Belgian citizenship, and at least one of their parents was not born Belgian. That means that to have the Belgian origin, in our definition for the report, you have to be born Belgian with both parents born as Belgian nationals. We can even differentiate further and look at migrant background by looking at an individual's grandparents, but for those figures, I have to refer you to the report itself. So what does the Belgian population at working age, about 7 million in total, look like? In 2019, 61 was of Belgian origin, almost 34% had a foreign origin, and for 4.7% of the population, we still do not have sufficient information to determine their exact origin. If we then look at the breakdown of those people who are of foreign origin, we see that just over half of them are of EU origin. The largest of them still being the EU 14 origin. These are the oldest EU member states, so the ones who became member first. But the group of EU 13 origin, so mainly the Eastern European EU countries, is clearly increasing since the beginning of our monitoring. Among the non-EU origins, the group of Maghreb origin is the largest in Belgium at about 16% in 2019, followed by sub-Saharan African origins, and then those from countries that are candidate EU members who are, in our case, mainly of Turkish origin. But of course, what interests us most today is the results of our monitoring. How has their situation on the Belgian labour market evolved? First of all, we will look at the usual suspects, so the large labour market indicators, employment rate and unemployment rate. And we see, of course, that there is an employment rate gap. Probably not surprising, the employment rate is still highest for people of Belgian origin, with a rate of, based on administrative data, 76.3% in 2019. The lowest employment rate is observed for people from the near Middle East, with a rate of only 40.6%, despite an increase of 6 percentage points over the period between 2016 and 2019. So they remain at a very low employment rate. However, it should be noted that the proportion of recent immigrants of this origin rose sharply between 2008 and 2019. So this group has not yet acquired Belgian citizenship and faces probably specific obstacles such as insufficient knowledge of one of the national languages or an unrecognized degree, etc. Despite a positive trend for all the origins, only people of Belgian origin and those from an EU country had an employment rate of above 60% in 2019. When we look at the unemployment rate gap, first of all, we see that the unemployment rate has also evolved favorably for all origins. Indeed, the years 2018-2019 were in general very, very good years for the Belgian labour market, but it remains the lowest, again, not surprisingly, for those of Belgian origins who had an unemployment rate of only 3.6%. It is the highest for people of Maghreb origin, followed by those of sub-Saharan African origin. Groups that, contrary to the Middle Eastern origin that we just talked about, have actually seen an increase in the proportion of persons that have acquired Belgian nationality or who are even second-generation migrants. So it is much more difficult to see what is causing this gap for these groups. Our second or third important indicator is then the inactivity rate by origin. And we see again that positive news, the inactivity rate fell between 2017 and 2019 for all origins. It is again lowest for people of Belgian origin at only 17.6%, and it is highest, unsurprisingly, given their low employment rate, for people of the near Middle East at 50.6%. Some origins also have very high inactivity rates, such as people from an EU candidate country, the Maghreb, other European countries, the Far East, and other Asian countries. And it is important to note that while the Belgian inactive population is mainly retired, so they've started their retirement quite early because we only look at people until 64, but also they are increasingly in incapacity to work. Those of near Middle Eastern and sub-Saharan African origin, when they are inactive, are mainly on social welfare benefits recipients. So there is a big difference if we look at the composition of an activity. Of course, employment and activity rates vary within origin groups. There are very large gaps by gender, age, household type. And in the report, we look at a large number of these characteristics. But this morning, I will limit myself to education, a variable which certainly in Belgium has a very large effect on labor market outcomes, and also a variable that we have been able to capture in a big level of detail based on administrative data. The first thing to notice is that higher education graduates, who are in gray on the slide, have higher employment rates than medium-skilled for all origins, who have in turn a better position than the low-skilled. But what is striking in this gap is that the employment rate of people of foreign origin with a higher education degree is still lower than that of people of Belgian origin with the same level of education. The gap between people of Belgian origin has narrowed for every level of education and for almost all origins, but strikingly, the gap is still widest among those with higher education degrees. So even if a higher education degree contributes to labor market integration, studying pays less for persons of foreign origin. Even if we consider on this slide only those those with a higher education degree and break this down by bachelor, master, and PhDs, we see that a certain diploma does not have the same added value for everyone. When it comes to the employment rate, we see even more remarkable differences between the origin groups. Longer studies are, on average, as you can see, associated with a higher employment rate, but this is not true for all cases. As you can see, masters from EU 14 countries, the EU 13 countries, candidate EU member states, the Far East and South Central America, actually have lower employment rates than bachelors from the same origin. And interestingly, PhD holders of sub-Saharan African origin appear least likely to be employed of all higher education graduates, except for bachelors of near Middle Eastern origin, the group of which you already know that they face the greatest challenges. If we then only look at those with a master degree and we look at fields of studies, it becomes even more interesting. Because of course, you could say that differences between origin groups could be explained by the field of study that people have chosen. So on this slide, we've taken that out. We only look at master degrees and the fields of studies. And we again see that the gap remains very wide. So as you can see, people of Belgian origin and people of foreign origin, even with the same degree and the same field of study, still have an employment gap. And this is particularly the case in the fields of education, science and mathematics, and services. It is possible that the sectors to which these fields lead place more weight on language skills, particularly in teaching, which means that migrants could encounter additional difficulties, but it is still hard to explain what can explain the big gap even at this level of detail. We see, for example, that the graduates in health and welfare are quite sought after on our labor market, and they have the highest employment rates for all origins. But even here, there is still a gap of 12.2 percentage points between people of Belgian origin and those of non-EU origin. So while Belgian graduates with a master in health have an employment rate of 94.4%, non-EU graduates only arrive at 82.2%, which is, again, a bit hard to explain. Now, as is clear from the first indicators that I have presented, persons of foreign origin are less likely to be employed, but our report also gives some insight in the quality and characteristics of their work when they have entered the labor market. So first of all, we look here at the wage distribution among wage deciles, and it shows that people of Belgian origin are most strongly overrepresented in the highest wage classes and underrepresented in the lower classes. In this graph specifically, we see the shares of different origin groups in the 3 lowest deciles by level of education. And what stands out immediately is the relatively high shares of most foreign origin groups in the low wage classes for each level of education. We also see that higher education pays, literally, for everyone. Workers with a higher education degree have smaller shares of low wages than the other levels, but within each level of education, people of Belgian origin have the smallest share of low wages. For people with a higher education degree, the share of low wages among the Belgian origin is less than 10%, while for people of other Asian origin and other European origin, it still fluctuates at around 40%, meaning that even with a bachelor or a master, they will probably earn less than their peers from other origin groups. In order to understand why people of foreign origin, even with a similar field of study and level of education, are less often in employment, and when they are, receive lower pay, we can look if there is a greater skills mismatch for them. This slide shows for 5 groups of sectors the higher education graduates working in these sectors. We can see that in the generally lower paid sectors, mainly industry, transport, and education, people of Belgian origin most often have a degree in the field specific to the sector. So, for example, when you're working in education as a Belgian, you will probably have a degree in education. Non-EU origins, on the other hand, show a more diversified distribution between fields of study. In well-paid sectors, such as financial activities or information and communication, people of foreign origin more often have the specific degree for that sector, while people of Belgian origin can end up in these sectors with fields of studies that are not specific to the sectors. So it seems that there is actually a sort of inverse skills mismatch in Belgium. People of Belgian origin find themselves in sectors with relatively high salaries without having a specific degree, whereas people of non-European origin only end up there with the specific degree. This observation is, I should note, much less pronounced in 2018 than it was in earlier years, which could be linked to the growing tightness of the labor market, leading perhaps to less emphasis on diploma requirements. Now, there is much more to say about the labor market situation, but for the remainder of my presentation, I would like to show you the result of our focus chapters, because our detailed administrative data enables us to analyze some very specific characteristics of workers that can influence their labor market position. In the latest report, we have looked firstly at grade repetition and whether someone has worked during their studies. I will start by grade repetition, which is in our concept actually a measurement of the delay in relation to the legal school age at the time of graduation from upper secondary education. In other words, we have looked if a person is older than 18 when graduating from secondary school. On this graph, you see only persons for which data on grade repetition is available, because of course there are some people missing in the data. And it shows that in 2018, 67.3% of 20 to 34-year-olds were not behind in their schooling when they graduated from upper secondary education, while 32.7% was behind, mainly by 1 year, in some cases by 2 or even more years. And again, there are indeed differences by origin. So if we break this down, we see that people of Belgian and EU14 origin have the highest shares with no grade repetition, who just graduated at 18. The lowest shares of people with no grade repetition are observed for people from other European origins and from EU candidate countries, where we see that about 34% have reach the end of secondary school without repeating a grade. The situation of people of sub-Saharan African origin and other European origin is particularly striking, as the shares of those with a 2-year delay in schooling are close to 20% and even above 10% for those who have repeated grades 3 times and more during these studies. So a very significant delay. But besides having entered the labor market at a later age than their peers, what effect does grade repetition have? First of all, our data indicates that grade repetition is also negatively related to obtaining a higher education degree. So it makes your studies afterwards more difficult. Of course, we do not know what causes the relation or in what direction there is causality, but we do see a link. And secondly, and this is shown on this slide, it also seems to affect or be linked to their employment rates. The employment rate of people aged 25 to 34 who never repeated a grade at the time of graduation from upper secondary school is, regardless of origin, higher than that of people who have repeated a grade. The highest employment rate is, again, observed for people of Belgian origin without grade repetition, and the lowest for people of sub-Saharan African origin who did repeat at least 1 grade. The employment rate of grade repeaters of Belgian origin is still higher than the employment rate of other origins who never repeated a grade, and the more frequent their grade repetition, so the more years they have redone, the lower their employment rate. If we break this down according to the level of education obtained in the end, so have they stopped after secondary school, or did they also gain a master or a bachelor afterwards, shows that it appears to be a relatively larger setback for higher education graduates. But we do not know if this is linked to the fact that they also had to repeat grades in higher education. Now, the other theme that we have looked at is student work. In Belgium, as you might know, students can work as an accessory activity from the age of 15 onwards, as long as they do not exceed a certain number of hours for the time that is 475 hours per year. So many students in Belgium work during weekends or holidays, and we know that the reasons to do this are mainly financial. This could range from gaining a bit of extra pocket money to actually financing part of their studies themselves when their parents have limited means to do so. But even if their reasons are financial, the resulting work experience they gain can, of course, be an asset when they enter the labor market after graduation. Our analysis focuses on the population of 15 to 24 years old. It is possible that people are studying longer, but this is the main group involved. And for each of these young people, we have looked in the 4 quarters of the year under analysis to see if they have had a student job. And we find that in 2019, in total, more than 500,000 young people aged 15 to 24 meet this definition, which corresponds to almost 40% of the total population in this age group. So first, a clear conclusion is that student work is quite popular in Belgium. And among those having a student job, we see that Belgians have the highest share of student work, with 43.1% of student workers, followed by the Sub-Saharan African and the Maghreb origin, while people from the Near Middle East, the EU 13 and North America lag behind in the share of student work. The low participation of the latter may be explained for some by lower financial motivation, but, and this is important to note, also by a more frequent recourse to undeclared work, which would of course be invisible in administrative data. So this you should keep in mind. In yellow on the slide, we see the shares among higher education graduates only. And the overwhelming majority of higher education graduates aged between 20 and 24 are, non-surprisingly, of Belgian origin. But this is also the case for those who work alongside their studies. However, the higher education students most likely to have a student job are those from Sub-Saharan African origin and from South Central America, with shares of over 50%. But actually, we see that if we only look at the higher education degrees, a lot of other origins also have higher shares than Belgian students. So during higher education, it seems that, relatively speaking, Belgians tone down the student jobs a little bit, while the others don't. Now, again, what does this mean for their employment prospects? On this graph, you see the intensity of student work in 2019. This is the number of hours worked over the last 3 years. These total hours are then grouped into 3 categories. Otherwise, we would have two small groups and a problem to map this data. So we've mapped in groups of 250 hours or less, more than 250 hours, but less than 500, and finally, more than 500 hours of student work over 3 years. If we then focus on persons aged 20 to 24, who have a higher education qualification, to not make the level of education a variable in their employment prospects, we can see that 6 origins had a high intensity of student work with a share of over 50%. And these are people from other European countries, the Maghreb, Sub-Saharan Africa, and EU candidates. This intensity of work for these oranges could actually be a cause of concern, as working a significant number of hours while pursuing a full course of study may jeopardize the success of your studies and therefore increase inequalities on the labor market afterwards. It should also be borne in mind that this is probably an underestimate, as many students could work undeclared, and some employers could maybe be urging students to work during course hours, which not only risks undermining their grades, but it could also cause them to lose their student status and so their child benefits. However, we see that the fact of having worked while studying seems to go together with a slightly higher employment rate. So this is in orange, the employment rate gap between people who have not worked as a job student and who have worked as a job student. And we see that on average, the advantage is about 1.8 percentage points, which is not nothing, but this advantage actually seems much larger for people of foreign origin who have worked a student job. The difference is very striking for people from the EU 13, who gain almost 15 percentage points, and from other European origins who gain a bit more than 14 percentage points, what makes their employment rate actually go from a mere 65% to 80%. This improvement is also quite significant for people from the Near Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, even though their increased employment rate, of course, remains low to that of native Belgians. Although we were unable to establish a direct link between student work intensity and their employment rate 5 years later, we can see that it is not necessarily the origins that work the most that increase their future chances on the labor market. The simple fact of having worked during studies, regardless of the intensity, seems to have an added value in terms of access to the labor market. On the other hand, people from EU candidate countries and the Maghreb, who more frequently work very long hours, seem to improve their chances less than other origins. So again, this means that probably working a lot of hours and possibly having this job overlap with your course hours could become a problem if it interferes with the successful completion of a later degree. The last focus chapter I will briefly talk about is the one on the impact of COVID-19. And the previous slides have shown us that the labor market situation of people with a foreign origin has remained vulnerable even in 2018 and 2019, which were years with a very thriving labor market. So of course, we knew that there was a high risk that the impact of the crisis on this group, as on other vulnerable groups, would be disproportionate. The first very important sanitary measure was teleworking. This, of course, existed long before the arrival of COVID-19, and the graph shows that before 2020, so up till here, people born outside the EU less often, occasionally or regularly worked from home than those born in Belgium or in the EU, which goes hand in hand with the lower proportion of people with a higher education qualification because they are less likely to end up in white-collar jobs. From the first quarter of 2020, when the pandemic started, the share of teleworkers increases for all groups very clearly, but especially for employees born in Belgium or the EU. The latter even show the highest increase, perhaps due to the additional difficulty for cross-border workers or difficulties to commute back and forth if you're living in the EU. So the difference between non-EU nationals increased during the health crisis, and it remains very significant throughout 2021. This means that people of non-EU origin had to leave their homes more often than others, thus running a greater risk of being infected. Oh, I had some arrows. So, on the contrary, some people were not able to work from home because their job did not lend itself to teleworking. And that means that some people were not able to work and they were at risk of suffering a loss of income. The alternative in Belgium was the job retention scheme that allowed workers to stay home while receiving temporary unemployment benefits. And we know from other chapters that people of non-EU origin are overrepresented in construction, hospitality, retail, and support services, precisely the sectors that have had to reduce or interrupt their activities most and for the longest during the crisis. Moreover, although these are sectors with the highest proportion of temporary unemployment for all workers, there are still major differences between the origin groups within these sectors. In the hotel and catering sector, sector I, for example, we see that for workers of Belgian origin, the share of temporary unemployment was only 41.5% in the second quarter of 2020, while for people of non-EU origin, this share was 55.6%. The share of temporary unemployment is slightly lower for workers of foreign origin only in information and communication, which is J, and real estate sectors, L. So this means that in all other sectors, the loss of income during the crisis is probably less important for people of Belgian origin than for others because they were temporarily unemployed for shorter periods and for a more limited part of their working time. Finally, my last graph, this graph shows the proportion of people who were working at the end of 2019 and who have become unemployed by the second quarter of 2020. So not temporary unemployed, but just standard unemployment. They have lost their job. And we can see again that people of Belgian origin are less likely to have lost their job than people of EU and non-EU origin. Actually, only 0.8% of workers of Belgian origin working at the end of 2019 were unemployed in the second quarter of 2020, compared with 1.7% of those of EU origin and 3.1% of those of non-EU origin. Higher education graduates were less likely to become unemployed than those with lower qualifications. And we also found that among those in employment at the end of 2019, people of non-EU origin are more likely to be unemployed in the first, second, and third quarter of 2020. So when they become unemployed, they also tend to have more persistent unemployment. This was also already the case before the pandemic. So to conclude on this chapter, although people of non-EU origin are a very heterogeneous group and there are still large differences within this group, we see that they are less likely to be able to telework, that they were at a higher than average risk of being put on temporary unemployment and thus suffering a minor but maybe not, still a significant loss of income, and to become fully unemployed or inactive. These were, in a nutshell, some of the observations of our monitoring. I will now pass the floor to Tom to draw some general conclusions.
Thanks again, Anne. So when we draw conclusions from our reports, we don't only look at the data in the report, but we try to relate them to our previous editions and to what we learn from other research and publications, mainly from those coming from institutions such as the European Commission and the OECD and also the ILO. And in this report in particular, also some work by the academic EMILab project. So the main observation, however, doesn't require a lot of reading and research, though. If we can have the graph on the screen, we can easily see what it is about. We are a very bad performer when we look at labor market integration of foreigners. In this graph, foreigners means non-nationals, but as the report shows, the problem extends to new generations, even when they take Belgian citizenship. And this problem is to a very large extent a structural issue. Nevertheless, when we look at the series of reports, the position of people from foreign origin has improved, both in absolute as well in relative terms since our first report came out, as tighter labor markets offer more opportunities, and also people from foreign origin suffered less from the continuous deindustrialization and the decrease in public employment than those with a Belgian origin. Now, as Anne explained, our labor market in general with the COVID crisis quite well. And we also have to add that the performance of our labor market is at an all-time high since the pandemic. It has also showed, again, how vulnerable people of foreign origin are, in the same way as young people and the low-skilled, and often these categories overlap. As I said, this points to structural factors. Our labor market is segmented, with one part with a high turnover, a lot of part-time work, low-paid jobs, and not so general social security provisions when you happen to lose your job. And then there's the other part with stable, most often full-time jobs with seniority wages, company cars, for instance, and with social security provisions based on longer careers and that are relatively generous in an international perspective, or also with easier access to training opportunities and, for instance, also to childcare. Now, as our labor market is highly averse to all types of mobility, geographical and professional mobility, it's not easy to get from one part of the labor market, from one segment to the other. Of course, things are much more nuanced than I tell you now. For that, you need to read the whole report, but this is the broad picture. And our labor market is not only segmented, it also comes with high barriers, both on the supply as well as on the demand side, in the shape of unemployment traps and other traps, but also far from perfect information about the labor market. And on the other hand, very high labor costs. An obvious barrier that Patrick Charlet already pointed to is discrimination in the labor market, both discrimination of the direct kind as well of the indirect type, which means that there are procedures that are as such not designed to discriminate, but they do lead to unequal results. An example there could be excessive language requirements for some jobs. Finally, one of the Belgian paradoxes is that monetary inequality in Belgium is relatively low, but inequality of opportunities is substantial. We see this in our education system, where the OECD PISA studies do not only show a general degradation, but also very substantial inequalities exacerbated, as this report shows, by grade repetition that is much more frequent here than in the large majority of other countries. If I remember correctly, the OECD has shown that it's only more frequent in Colombia and in Luxembourg. And we don't make up for this education backlog on the labor market itself. Lifelong learning is clearly still insufficiently developed in our country. And it's hard to overlook, finally, the specific issue of women of foreign descent and the issue of gender roles. Now, our report ends with a couple of recommendations. Well, what to recommend on this basis? Obviously, the main recommendation is to undo all of the structural factors that I just mentioned. Often this means doing something which would be good for everyone, but from which people with a foreign origin will just benefit more than others. A good example is making our labor market more mobile, or reinforcing the convergence between different labor market statuses, and also increasing the transparency of our labor market. Of course, measures to explicitly encourage diversity will help as well, for instance, by focusing more on skills and less on formal certificates, as would tackling discrimination in all its forms. Education reform is much discussed in Belgium, in particular in this period when the new schooling year has just started, and it's clear that there is also scope for improvement on that side. The challenge is to both increase the overall skills level and to reduce inequalities. Getting migration policies right is obviously also key, in particular in the long run, and there the European Union has undoubtedly a role to play. And finally, we could not end this report without some recommendations on improving the statistical apparatus in Belgium to improve access to the invaluable source of information that is the data warehouse, and to integrate more data with it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. So that concludes the part on the Belgian data, and we are very happy that we also got some international labor market experts or migration experts to discuss these results in a wider context. So as I said, we will leave questions until the end of the webinar. And then I would now like to introduce to you Veerle Miranda. She is a senior economist in the Directorate for Employment, Labour and Social Affairs of the OECD. She leads the Youth and Diversity Policies Unit, more particular, and is a driving force behind the OECD Youth Action Plan and the OECD recommendation on creating better opportunities for young people. Her team works closely with governments of OECD members, as Belgium, in order to improve their youth policy. So we thought that given the fact that we have 2 chapters specifically looking at young people in our monitoring, it would be very good to have some perspectives from OECD countries on school to work transitions. So Miranda Veerle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this very nice introduction and also for the invitation to speak at this webinar. I'm very impressed by the quality of the report that you're publishing. And also, of course, the findings for Belgium are a hugely valuable contribution to our own understanding of the labor market integration by migrant background, right? Because by linking this national registered data with social security data, you obtain such a valuable data set and important insights that we cannot obtain from the survey data. So I found the report very interesting and very pleasant to read. So very well done, well done. So you have asked me to look at the school to work transition from an OECD perspective. So I will present you some findings from a recent OECD EU publication on the indicators of immigrant integration that was prepared by my colleagues in the migration division. And so I extracted some of the relevant indicators on young people specifically. And then I will also say a few words about the work that we in the youth team are doing on youth policy specifically, and in particular, the OECD recommendation on creating better opportunities for young people that was adopted by all OECD member countries in 2022, and also the OECD Youth Policy Toolkit that we're currently developing. So that will be at the end of my presentation. So let me start now with some general facts about young people with foreign origin in EU and OECD countries. So the data shows that across the OECD, 28% of young people between the age 15 and 34 are either foreign-born themselves or have foreign-born parents. And so the respective share in the EU is 23%. Now, of those, native-borns with at least one foreign-born parent account for 40% of OECD-wide, compared to 10% in the EU on average. Now, EU-wide, we see that half of the native-born youth population with 2 immigrant parents have a father born in Europe, while about 1/4 has a father of African origin, 1/5 has an Asian father, and only 5% has a Latin American father. Now, of the foreign-born who arrived as children, instead, we see that mostly they come from non-European countries, and especially Asia, noting, of course, that countries like Syria or Afghanistan are based on the Asian continent. And over the last decade, the share of young people with 1 or 2 foreign-born parents increased by 2.6% OECD-wide and a bit less in the European Union. Now, let's first look at some key educational indicators that we in the OECD have published on young people with a foreign origins. Now, this figure shows the share of highly educated 25 to 34-year-olds who finished their education, and that by parental origin for the year 2020. So the first bar in red shows that in the OECD, on average, native-born young adults of foreign-born parents are less likely than their peers of native-born parents to be highly educated. They're less likely to be highly educated. And the opposite is true in non-EU countries like, for example, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And in Belgium, the difference in educational attainment by origin is actually the largest among the countries presented in the figure. Now, in contrast to foreign-born who arrive as adults, because there the educational attainment is a contextual indicator that depends, of course, on the country of origin, the educational attainment of immigrant children shows the success of the education system and the broader integration of immigrants in society. So there's clearly a lot of work to be done, especially in Belgium. Now, that said, on a positive note, the shares of both the highly educated native-born with foreign-born parents and those immigrants who arrived as children increased over the last decade in all of the countries presented in this chart, except there's two exceptions, which is Canada and Finland. So the situation is clearly improving in most countries. We also see that women, regardless of their parental origin, are more likely than men to be highly educated in all countries. Now, a second indicator that we show in the publication is the share of early school leavers, also called the school dropout. So young people who leave school prematurely lack the credentials for successful labor market entry and are thus prone to long-term social and economic disadvantages. The share of early school leavers is measured in this figure by the share of young people who are neither in education nor training and have gone no further than lower secondary school. We see that in the European Union, the dropout rate is 11% among native-born with foreign-born parents, which is higher than the 8% that we see among their peers with native-born parents. The dropout rate among foreign-born who arrived as children is even higher. And so in general, school dropout is more of a concern for people from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, right? And it's also more common among young men than among women, regardless their foreign origin. Again, on a positive note, as we saw with the previous indicator, dropout rates have fallen over the last 8 years in most countries. So there's a clear improvement also in school dropout. A third indicator that we look at is intergenerational educational mobility, because we see that young people with foreign-born parents are often strongly motivated to attain higher education. Upward educational mobility allows them to catch up with their peers of native-born parents and to thrive economically and socially later in life. And so across EU countries, native-born young people with at least one foreign-born parent are more likely to better their parents' educational attainment than the native-born offspring of native-born parents. And a similar finding holds for Belgium, right? So the ones with a foreign-born parent are more likely to do better than their parents. In virtually all countries, young native-born women with foreign-born parents outperform their peers with native-born parents. So for specifically for women, there's a clear intergenerational educational mobility. And again, over the past 8 years, we see that intergenerational educational mobility has increased in most countries, except for a few Central European countries like Spain, Italy, France, and Switzerland. But in all other countries, intergenerational mobility has really improved. And of course, it's part of it is the educational system, but it's also general support structures, or for example, educational aspirations of both the parents and the children that affect the intergenerational transmission of transmission of disadvantages. Next, we look at the basic reading skills, because poor basic reading proficiency, of course, hinders very much the integration in the labor market, but also in the society more broadly. And in the EU, on average, but also in Belgium specifically, the difference between the groups is huge. 29% of native-born pupils with foreign-born parents lack basic reading skills. For those who are foreign-born, the share increases to 38%. That while among those with native-born parents, the share of those who lack basic reading skills is only 18%, which actually is still pretty high. But these socioeconomic disadvantages are often an important element in the weaker performance of children with a foreign background. And children who are living in disadvantaged families lag behind the more socioeconomic advanced families, and the differences are huge, right? So socioeconomic disadvantages are an important element in the weaker performance of children with a foreign background. And then another factor is that it's not only their family's socioeconomic background, but it's also the region or the area in which they live, because we see that children of immigrants often live in disadvantaged areas, and the schools in those areas do not necessarily have the means, or it's more complicated, and that's another reason why we see that children of immigrants or foreign or native-born children of foreign-born parents lag behind in their basic reading skills. Now, the transition from school to work can, of course, be particularly challenging for young people with foreign origins. First of all, because of their educational performance, but also because they tend to have fewer social networks or a proper knowledge of the local labor market. And on top, they must also fight discrimination. So they're at a greater risk of being neither in employment, formal education, or trainings, which we call the need group. And being need can have long-term negative consequences on career trajectories later on. And so this indicator shows the proportion of young adults who are needs by parental origin. And so we see that among native-born young people with foreign-born parents, 1 in 6 is need in both the EU and the OECD on average. In Belgium, the rate reaches 1 in 4, both for native-born with foreign-born parents and for foreign-born who arrived as children. So the rate in Belgium is at the highest among OECD countries. On a more positive note, the need rates have dropped over the last decade, regardless of the parental origin, also in Belgium. The data also show that young people and the poorest educated are most likely to be in need. But even we see that even highly educated young people with foreign-born parents have higher need rates than those with native-born parents. So education is part of the story, but definitely not all of it. Now let's turn to some labor market indicators, and we start with employment. So in most OECD countries, native-born young people of foreign-born parents are less likely to be employed than their peers of native-born parentage or immigrants who arrived as children. On average, in the OECD, we see that 68% of native-born young people with foreign-born parents are in employment, compared to 75% among native-born parents. And so the employment rate of young people with foreign origin is particularly weak in Belgium, where only 56% of both native-born with foreign-born parents and foreign-born who arrived as children are employed. Now, we know that lower employment rates among young people with foreign-born parents are partly due to their lower levels of education. But as we already learned from Anne's presentation, being highly educated doesn't mean that the employment gap is closed with native-borns, right? Overall, we see that the employment rates are particularly low among native-born young people with parents born outside the EU. So also the origin of migration has an impact. Again, on a positive note, we see that the employment rates of young people with foreign origins are higher than a decade ago in almost all OECD countries, and the gap with native-borns is actually being reduced in recent years. As for unemployment, young people with foreign origins are more likely to be unemployed than their native-born peers with native-born parents, and the gap is particularly large for native-borns with foreign-born parents. This finding is true for most OECD countries, but especially in long-standing European destinations. In the EU, on average, 17% of native-born of foreign-born parents are unemployed, against only 10% of their peers with native-born parents and 12% for those who are foreign-born young people. In Belgium, the gap is particularly large compared to other OECD countries. And so we see that in Belgium, there's a 6% unemployment among native-borns with native-born parents, compared to 19% of unemployment among foreign-born who arrived as children. The data also show that young men are much more prone to unemployment than young women in virtually all OECD countries. As with all the figures so far, on a positive note, we see that youth unemployment has dropped between 2012 and 2020 in most countries. There are, though, a few exceptions, like the United States, but also Norway and Finland, where youth unemployment has actually increased. Now, let me finish my presentation with a few words on the OECD recommendation on creating better opportunities for young people, which was adapted by all OECD countries in 2022. So this recommendation provides policy suggestions to policymakers in all our member countries in 5 broad areas. So we provide recommendations in the area of skills and competences, also how to improve labor market outcomes for young people. We look at social elements, so how can we improve social outcomes, but also well-being more generally of young people. There's 2 chapters who are devoted to public governments more broadly. So like, for example, young people's trust in government and relationship with public institutions, and then also some recommendations on the administrative and technical capacities to address age-based inequalities in societies. Now, the recommendation devotes particular attention to the heterogeneity of young people, right? We see, of course, outcomes very much differ across young people, not only by migrant status, but also by other characteristics of diversity, like race, gender, ethnicity, disability, etc. Right? So the recommendation devote particular attention to that heterogeneity among young people. And so for those interested, you can find the OECD Youth recommendation via the link at the bottom of this slide. And I can also mention that we're currently collecting good practices, good policy practices and programs from OECD countries for a new OECD youth policy toolkit that we're currently developing. And so the aim of this toolkit is to provide hands-on practical guidance for our member countries to improve the design and implementation of their youth policies. Now, the toolkit is still under development, so there's unfortunately nothing I can share with you on this, but we are still looking for good examples in the youth policy area. So I will certainly follow up with some of you to learn more about some of the policy practices that were mentioned at the beginning. And it's because especially we're looking for good policy examples in the area of discrimination, which is, of course, an important topic given the focus of this webinar. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for listening to my presentation. And so feel free to reach out if you would be interested to learn more about our work on youth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Veerle, for providing this context, even though it maybe hasn't improved the Belgium image much, but it was certainly food for thought. I have some questions myself, but I will also wait until the end, as it is now my pleasure to introduce Eliza Marks, who is technical officer at ILO headquarters with over 10 years experience working with the ILO both regionally and at the Geneva headquarters, implementing regional projects aimed at improving labor migration governance frameworks and protecting migrant workers' rights. In her current role, she provides technical supports to governments like ours, but also trade unions and the private sectors on labor migration, with a focus on gender mainstreaming and women migrant workings. But we have asked her specifically because the ILO also gained a lot of insight on how migrant workers have coped during COVID-19. So Eliza, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I will be speaking about our research and our findings on the situation of migrant workers during COVID-19. But I thought I would start first with a couple of slides about the ILO and how we work and what we do. So for those who are not familiar, the ILO is a United Nations agency for the world of work. We're more than 100 years old now, founded in 1919. We're a bit different to other UN agencies in that we have a tripartite approach where we bring together equally representatives from government, workers and employers organizations from our 187 member states. And these workers organizations come from the International Trade Union Confederation and the employers representatives from the International Organization for Employers. We're also a standard setting organization. So we bring together the tripartite partners to discuss, negotiate and adopt international labor standards, which can take the form of conventions, recommendations and protocols. And this takes place at our annual International Labor Conference, which takes place in June here in Geneva. A core principle or means of working for the ILO is our Declaration on the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, of which there are 5. The first is on freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. The second is on elimination of forced labor. Third, on child labor. The fourth is on elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. And just as of last year, actually, we amended the declaration to include a 5th one, which is on the right to a safe and healthy work environment. And perhaps we can see the link to COVID-19 there. As was introduced, I work in the labour migration branch of the ILO, and we take a rights-based approach to addressing labour migration. We're interested in migrants as workers and applying labour standards to protect their rights. We do have a constitutional mandate to protect migrant workers, and it was mentioned in our constitution back in 1919. In terms of the rights of migrant workers, all of the international labour conventions do apply to migrant workers, but we do have some specific ones to address labour migration directly, and that is the Migration for Employment Convention of 1949 and also the Migrant Workers Supplementary Provisions Convention of 1975. Importantly, the declaration that I mentioned earlier applies to all migrants, but also includes workers in an irregular situation, so undocumented workers as well. So in addition to these 2 key standards on migration, I also mentioned 2 others that I think are quite critical. The third one is the Private Employment Agencies Convention, C181. In certain contexts, in particular in the context that I work in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the role of private employment agencies and different intermediaries plays a big role in facilitating migration across borders. And so governance of these agencies is really critical. Another one I'd mention is the protocol to the Forced Labour Convention. This protocol was adopted in 2014 as a way to sort of update and refresh the Forced Labour Convention, which was adopted in 1930. So that was really necessary. And this protocol really brings the issues of forced labour into the 21st century, looking at issues of global supply chains and making the link between migration and fair recruitment and forced labour and trafficking. So I think together these 4 4 conventions, along with the fundamental ones, are the critical sort of package of standards that we're working with. And then just lastly on the ILO, just to explain simply how the ratification process works, once the conventions are adopted at the International Labour Conference, they're open for ratification by member states, who then go through a process of adaptation of their national legislation in line with the convention. And in doing so, they commit to reporting regularly to the supervisory machinery of the ILO, which is principally the Committee of experts on the application of conventions and recommendations. And we also have a number of special procedures as well, including complaints procedures. So coming to the topic of COVID-19, I'm sure we'll agree that we're sort of in what we're calling a post-pandemic phase, where we're a bit more focused on labour market and economic recovery and really looking at lessons learned from the pandemic. But reflecting back, the ILO was able to provide a lot of data, statistics, and knowledge products for our constituents on COVID-19, and actually produced more than 170 policy publications. Our ILO statistics department, ILO Stat, has a real wealth of information, data tools, resources, country profiles, also looking at the issues sectorally as well. And this is still being really regularly updated, so I encourage you to take a look at that data catalogue as well. We were able to conduct rapid assessments in more than 47 countries, and since the beginning of the pandemic, the office was able to produce these regular monitor reports, we called them, done quarterly. And the latest version is from May 2023. Early on in the pandemic, we adopted this 4-pillar approach to guiding our policy interventions. So I've shared it here. The first one is stimulating the economy and employment. The second on supporting enterprises, jobs and income. The third on protecting workers in the workplace. And the fourth on relying on social dialogue for solutions. And then in 2021, at our International Labour Conference, we adopted our sort of flagship policy product on this, which was the global call to action for a human-centered recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. So I wanted to share here just a couple of key points from the latest version of the ILO monitor on COVID-19. As I mentioned, it's from May 2023. So the monitor is really focused on the multiple crises currently faced by many countries worldwide. So not just the economic recovery, but also conflict and natural disaster. And it focuses on the rising debt levels, which are constraining the policy responses. It found that global unemployment in 2023 is expected to fall below pre-pandemic levels to 191 million. And estimates show that low-income countries, in particular those in Africa and the Arab region, are the most behind. This version of the monitor also includes a new indicator, which is the jobs gap. This is an indicator to measure all persons who would like to work but do not have a job. So in this way, it's seen as a more comprehensive measure of unmet demand for employment. And again, this was highest in low-income countries at 21%, 11% in middle income, and 8% in high income. I also wanted to share a few figures from this report, the World Employment and Social Outlook Report of 2023. We call it the WESO report. This is a really flagship product from the ILO that we release regularly. And this version was focused on this concept of key workers, which I think you'll also recognize became quite an essential topic during COVID-19, the idea of key workers or essential workers. So the ILO defines 8 occupational groups. So I've listed them here, although it's quite small for me to read, but I'll try. Food systems, health, retail, security, manual workers, cleaning and sanitation, transport, and then clerical workers. So within these 8 categories, the report finds that they suffer from poor working conditions, which exacerbate employee turnover and labour shortages, which jeopardize the provision of these basic services, these essential services. And as we all know, during the COVID-19 crisis, these key workers suffered higher mortality rates. And across the world, they are more likely to be low paid, and nearly a third are on temporary contracts. And critically to what we're discussing today, they employ a really large share of migrants, especially in high income countries. And the report really emphasizes that improvements in the working conditions and greater investments in food systems, healthcare, and other key sectors will be essential for building economic and social resilience to shocks. Okay. So now drawing a kind of a global picture on migrant workers. So the ILO estimates that there are 169 million migrant workers, constituting 4.7% of the labor force, although there's very significant regional differences. For example, in the Gulf countries, migrants can make up to 98% of the labor force. As we just mentioned, they're really focused often in essential jobs in healthcare, including care work, transport, services, construction, agriculture, and agri-food processing. And these are sectors which are characterized by high levels of temporary or informal and unprotected work, low wages, and also lack of social protection. I also wanted to share a little bit of data on the wage gap. So we did a report, I think last year, on the migrant wage gap, which found that migrants earn nearly 13% less than national workers in high income countries. And women migrant workers face a double wage penalty. And the report found that a significant part of this pay gap cannot be explained remains unexplained even when workers' characteristics such as education, experience, age, or location are accounted for. And this data is from pre-2020, so it doesn't take into account what the experience is during COVID-19, but we will be doing an update to that report in selected countries soon. And I think the sort of general conclusion, or the general conclusion for the ILO as reflecting back on COVID-19, is that the pandemic exposed existing structural deficits in both labor migration governance and protection of migrant workers' rights, but also introduced new areas of concern that we need to focus on. So the report that I was asked to speak specifically on is this report we did called Locked Down and in Limbo was the title. And this was a global report that brought together key findings from 17 different rapid assessments that we conducted in major countries of origin and destination. So I've listed the countries here. We don't have any coverage in European countries. So mainly focused on Southeast Asia and South Asia, also covering Latin America and some countries in Africa. The reason that these countries were chosen is really to do with these are the countries where we have the most work, we have the most presence in the field, we have the most engagement with partners, and we were able to conduct these assessments rapidly. These are also countries where you have a focus on or a large majority of the migrant workers are temporary low-wage migrant workers, and also migrant workers who are moving in a mixed migration context. So that means labor migrants, but also forcibly displaced people, particularly in Latin America and Africa region. And we undertook these assessments through our local partners and networks. These were mostly conducted in the second quarter of 2020, hence the data is from really early on in the pandemic. Excuse me. And given the rapid nature of these assessments and how they were done really in the height of the crisis, they have a very varied methodology and a different focus and detail. So there are really challenges in comparability of the data. These reports didn't really contain a lot of hard data, but in bringing them together in this global report, we were able to draw out some key findings and a lot of similar experiences, actually. As I mentioned, the role of the private recruitment agencies is really significant in some of these migration corridors, and a big focus of our work is on supporting governments to better regulate, monitor, and enforce these agencies. And in particular, the issue of worker paid recruitment fees and costs. So according to international labour standards, workers should not pay anything for their recruitment. But But in reality, in many of these contexts, workers are paying very high fees for their to secure employment abroad, leaving them in debt. And this large amount of debt is actually an indicator or can lead workers into situations of forced labor. So just to mention that this issue of fair recruitment and worker paid fees and costs is a big focus of these reports, and we see that those concerns in the results as well. So in terms of the key findings, we obviously saw a reduction in demand in certain sectors, but also increased demand in health and social care workers, including household domestic workers. We found that migrants were targeted for job losses and dismissal over national workers. And in fact, that was an explicit directive from governments in some countries as well. We can also talk about it being direct, and also indirect. But in some countries, it was mandated. For workers who didn't face dismissal, they also faced reduced hours of work or reduction and non-payment of wages. The living conditions of many migrant workers made isolation and distancing very difficult. Many of these workers, particularly in construction, hospitality, manufacturing sectors, are living in dormitories or in cramped conditions. And then, of course, the situation of domestic workers who live in households with their employers. We also had really alarming reports of food and water insecurity of many migrants who were living in employer-provided accommodation. Became quite a humanitarian issue at some point in many countries. And then in the surveyed countries, at least initially, we found that migrant workers were often excluded from policy responses, including wage subsidies and unemployment benefits. The obvious travel restrictions, the closures of borders, trapped migrants in countries of destination, often without options to return home, but the travel restrictions also affected migrants who were ready to be deployed. So those who were in a recruitment process in the country of origin and again had perhaps paid large fees expecting to be deployed were also not able to take up work. And we found that many migrants turned to irregular migration routes, so smuggling and trafficking channels in order to move. We did see in certain contexts mass detention and deportation of workers, and we saw that public health measures were often used to justify these. And in addition, obviously, the laid-off workers experienced job and income loss, but in many of these contexts, migrant workers' residency and work permits are tied. Their residency permits are tied to their employment, and so when they lose their employment, they also lose their right to remain in the country, and they were pushed into an irregular status, which had a flow-on effect of restricting access to services and support. So we can think of these workers as being pushed into an irregular status through no fault of their own. And when we're talking about low-wage migrant workers in these contexts, primarily the main motivation for migration is to send remittances home. And we saw a sharp decline in remittances with a flow-on effect on livelihoods of families in the home countries, although we did see recovery in June 2020, and the World Bank has a lot of data on this, on remittances, if you're interested to learn more. And of the workers that we surveyed, again, this issue of being able to service recruitment debts came up again and again as a key worry, a key concern. And at the same time, we saw the emergence of new recruitment fees and costs, so those related to testing, quarantine, protective equipment, masks and gel, etc. And it was often unclear who was responsible for paying for these. So I've chosen two areas to really focus on because there was a sort of a long list of challenges that came up, but I think two that were really critical and can help us kind of concentrate the issues further is access to social protection, and the second one is on emergencies and return and reintegration. So according with ILO standards, migrants should receive access to social protection, including healthcare and income security, in line with national workers, with the principle of non-discrimination. However, we know not just in the context of COVID-19, but in general, migrant workers face specific challenges in accessing social protection. And these may be a result of legal or administrative restrictions on their access, but also more practical barriers as well. And the ILO recommends that in the COVID-19 crisis, the short-term priority was a focus on ensuring access for migrant workers and their families, and in the long term, really strengthening universal national social protection floors and establishing bilateral agreements to enable also portability of entitlements. The ILO has also produced a number of policy products, including what we call an intervention model on how to reach workers in the informal economy, how to extend social protection to these workers. And in line with my other colleagues, I will share some positive examples of things that were taken as well. So this is just some selected examples, but in France and Spain, we saw extension of migrants' residence permits for additional 3 months to ensure access to healthcare. In Portugal, we saw regularization of non-nationals, including asylum seekers, with pending applications in order for them to access services, free medical consultations regardless of migrant status in Colombia. And then many countries, more high-income countries, were able to include migrant workers in cash transfer payments and emergency basic income. So as I said, the kind of second area that I wanted to focus on was cooperation in emergencies. So from the ILO perspective, effective governance of labour migration and protection covers the full migration cycle. We often see a big focus on recruitment of workers and deployment, and less focus or concern with the aspects of return and reintegration. And again, when we're talking about that the majority of workers in Asia, Arab states, and Africa are on temporary contracts, this return and reintegration aspect is really critical. They are expected to return often after a period of 2 years. But often the services are not provided for workers. In the surveys, we found that the repatriation measures varied significantly regionally, and a big challenge was the unclear lines of responsibility, including, as I mentioned, cost coverage. So there was debate among employers, the recruiters, countries of origin and destination on who would be responsible and how this could be coordinated. Another really critical aspect that came up with the surveyed workers was access to justice. And again, this is an issue for migrant workers, not just within COVID-19, but COVID-19 exposed the vulnerabilities. So when many workers lost their jobs and were forced to return to their countries of origin, they did so without wages and benefits. And I mentioned that the debt that many of them have from recruitment fees as well. And so many of the surveyed workers really emphasized the need to have access to justice and grievance mechanisms to enable recovery of those wages. It's quite difficult, as you can imagine, to ensure transnational access to justice for workers once they've left their country of employment and have returned home. And then the issue of stigmatization and discrimination. I think we all know well the challenges that migrants face in terms of discrimination at work and in communities in general, in countries all over the world. But the issue of stigmatization and discrimination for returning migrants also emerged from the research. So we saw sort of two categories: returning migrant workers seen as carriers of COVID-19 and communities not wanting them to return home. But then also there's this concept of the failed migrant. And this is not something just with COVID-19, it's in general and often related to young men who are perceived to have had a failed migration experience and that they have returned home without money and without perceived success. And then in terms of we also included in many of the surveys a question on remigration. So workers who had returned home, what were their plans? Did they plan to stay in the country of origin or to remigrate? And the vast majority wanted to migrate again. And this really pointed to the need to prepare for the opening up of migration channels again. Then, so the key recommendations from this report and from the ILO policy advice in general are really related to addressing the structural challenges in governance and protection through, I think, two key measures we can think of. The first one is inclusion on the basis of non-discrimination, so including migrant workers in recovery and social protection and occupational safety and health. And then this idea of better cooperation to ensure safe return and more effective governance. And here we just have some more specific examples. As I mentioned, the need to address specific occupational safety and health issues in migrant housing and accommodation, to ensure access to justice, in particular in relation to wage protection. Also providing adequate and accessible information to communities. I think sometimes it's not enough just to translate information materials into the workers' language. You also have to think about the channel of communication, who is speaking, how will this information be received, and really utilize local community networks and leaders when you're disseminating information. Also, as I mentioned, to really enhance this bilateral cooperation, the main instrument that we see used in the regions that I work in is bilateral labour migration agreements. So these need to be reviewed and their implementation strengthened in general, but also to include these elements on emergency and safe return. COVID-19 is unlikely to be the last emergency that we have. We have many examples of migrant workers being trapped through natural disaster, economic crisis, security, outbreak of war, etc. And these elements really need to be included and prepared for in advance. The issues of recruitment fees that I mentioned, greater strengthening of regulation of the industry, and then also lastly, looking at stigmatization and discrimination of workers in general as well. So these last two slides, I'll just share some of our key resources that we have on this. As I mentioned, the ILO produced a vast number of products on COVID-19, but here are some of the migrant worker ones. We had one on fair recruitment, social protection, seasonal migrant worker schemes. Also, we cover the issues of refugees and forcibly displaced people as well. And then I also wanted to share here a couple of our flagship publications from our department. So the first one here is a guidance note on wage protection for migrant workers. We also have one on temporary labour migration schemes, the migrant pay gap, which I mentioned, extension of social protection, protection of workers in an irregular situation. And this latest one here is on migrant workers' rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining. So I think I'll stop there. I hope that wasn't too fast, but thank you again for the opportunity. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Eliza. That was very interesting. And I think most of your recommendations, even though you have looked at different countries, are also very valuable for Belgium, actually. So next on our agenda was actually some reflections coming from your work that might feed into the next editions of our diversity reports. But I've actually come to the conclusion that my reflections are also questions. So I will just open with these questions to Veerle and Eliza, and then afterwards everyone else who has questions can also send them either in the chat if you prefer, or you can raise your little yellow hand and then I will give you the floor. So first of all, returning back to you, Veerle, we're of course looking forward to the policy examples that you've talked about, the good policy examples. I hope Belgium can provide some, but of course my main hope is that we can learn from the countries that are doing better, and I think for us one of the most important questions is why are some countries who have a very long migration history, such as Belgium, are actually doing so poorly. So this is, well, probably not a question you can answer right away. Perhaps you can already give some thoughts. And another smaller question I had is, we've seen that, for example, reading skills are very poor for young people with parents of foreign origin. But we also see that there is a positive trend in mobility when it comes to education outcomes. So what I was thinking is, does it mean that they could even do much better if they would receive help early on in schooling, for example, with reading, but maybe with other things as well? So maybe I'll let you respond first, and then I'll ask my questions to Eliza.
Yes, thank you, and that's a lot of questions. I hope I won't forget anything, because I wanted to touch on a few elements, right? Because well, first of all, about the integration, right? So why do some countries better than other countries, and why is the Belgian situation so complicated? And of course, I can't give you all the answers, and I'm certainly not a migrant specialist. But for young people in particular, of course, in Belgium we carry a long history of difficult migrant integration, right? So, as for example, compared to the United States, where migrants have always been very welcomed and they were fully integrated in society. Of course, they also experienced difficulties, whereas in Belgium, the initial generations of migrants really were not properly integrated, and that still has consequences on later generations. And so another element is that the concentration, right, in areas where it's a reinforcing aspect, right? If the schools have fewer means, of course, it will be much more difficult for children to do better, or to have the right necessary education to proceed in life. And just something that comes to my mind, because you mentioned the good policy practices, right? We've actually, I mean, the toolkit is still under development, right? So I can't really say what eventually will end up in the toolkit, but we came across a very nice example from France, actually, where they developed like a briefcase for parents on how to involve parents much more in the education of their children, because they noticed that especially parents of foreign origin are much less involved in the education of their children, and that had a huge impact on the performance of their children. And so they developed a whole, what they call briefcase, on how to integrate these parents much more into the education, to teach them or to inform them about their role and how everything can, I mean, how important it is, etc. So that's definitely, I think, a very nice example of a targeted policy that can really benefit young people from migrant origins. And indeed, as you say, right, you mentioned the aspect of intergenerational mobility. Now we see that, I think, for Belgium was one of the countries where, I mean, we're at the top, but it's in a positive way, right? That we see there's a lot of intergenerational mobility. Now, of course, we come from far, right? Because the first generation migrants had very low education, so it's easier to do better. But still, it's positive that that there is this possibility to have this intergenerational mobility. So that's now, of course, as you mentioned in your presentation, as we see in our data, having a good education is not yet sufficient, right? And because you still need to understand the local labor market, the habits, the network, etc. And again, there we have a very nice example on Belgium, actually, about mentoring. It's called Duo for Job. It's a program that is both in Belgium but also in the Netherlands and in France, about how people from from who are working either as an employer or in a company, who accompany migrants, specifically young migrant workers, in their transition from school to work, and giving them just advice like what they need to know, how to write a CV, where to look for jobs, create basically. I see that Duo for a Job is present. Good, very good. So I'm making promotion without knowing. Anyway, so we see that as a nice initiative of how we can help migrant, or not necessarily migrant, right? It's even young people with a migrant background, how to succeed better in the labor market. So these are two examples that come to my head straight away. But I'm sure there's definitely other examples as well.
Thanks. And thank you. I was going to mention that I did indeed see Elisabeth from Duo for a Job among the participants. So that's great. Returning back to Eliza then, you actually pointed to one of the biggest shortcomings, I think, of our COVID-19 chapter, and that is the fact that because we use administrative data, we of course do not capture undeclared work, and we do not know what happened with informal workers because we don't know where they are exactly. We know that some Belgian researchers suspect that undeclared work increased during the COVID period because they didn't have to take into account sanitary measures. Also because, for example, delivery platforms saw a big increase of their activity. So this leads some researchers to suspect that it increased with us as well. So my first question is, what is your assessment about it? Would it have increased as well in countries in the EU, for example? And secondly, a more practical question for us. Do you have any thoughts on how we could capture this better in coming editions? How could we capture informal economy, people with a less clear status on the labor market?
Thank you. Thank you for this question. Yeah, I think we're talking about two things, right? We're talking about undeclared work, which is work often called in the black market, unregistered work. And then I was talking also about irregular migrant workers, so migrant workers who don't have the right to stay and right to work. But of course, obviously, there's a lot of crossover. I think the ILO does have a new area of focus on these, what we call non-standard forms of work. We talk about disguised self-employment, the platform work, and we do know that migrants are represented highly in some of these sectors. The research so far talks about many of the challenges with these non-standard forms of work to do with social dialogue and protection. But also one of the findings was that it can be very beneficial for certain groups of workers to have access to the labor market because of the low barriers to entry. For example, young people and migrant workers, it can be easier for them to join this work. So we're looking at both of the issues there. I think we did not cover that in the research, and I think it would be something very important. And I'm not sure I could explain how to capture it better. I think I might need some of my statistics colleagues to give some more specific advice on that. But I think more and more this is becoming an issue that our constituents are coming to us with, and they're wanting to explore it more. So I think in the future we will start including this, exploring the links between undeclared work and non-standard forms of work and migration. I think we need to bring these two together a bit more. That's something to watch.
That's definitely something to look forward to. So are there any questions from the other participants? Okay, so There are questions in the chat. I will read them out for those who do not have access to the chat. So first of all, thanks to the speakers for the really interesting interventions. 2 questions. Isn't the fact that people repeating years during their studies also due to school integration, the lack of recognition of diplomas and the tradition of migrants of repeating a year or 2 when arriving in a new country? It would be interesting to know the age of migrants by level of study. Are the studies presented to the migrants themselves? So these are questions for me, actually. And I'm not sure I understand correctly the second question. Are the studies presented? Do you mean, do they get sufficient information about the content of studies, career prospects, things like that? So is it more guidance when choosing the study? Or do you mean, are the studies presented here also presented to migrants? You can also take the floor. Okay, so about the second question then. So we do try to also include in our mailing list people from migrant organizations in Belgium. So people working with migrants, but also with sans-papiers in Belgium. But I have to admit that I am not sure how many of them actually participate in webinars such as these, or the launch event that we have done. We do get a lot of interaction with people who are working, for example, at the public employment services, so VTB, Forum, etc. in Belgium. These we definitely reach, but I can't really tell you to what extent we reach the target stakeholders themselves. And then about your first question, of course, it is very difficult to untangle the different causalities behind grade repetition, because of course the fact that you are repeating a grade is probably already linked to a number of setbacks that you have. For example, difficulty in learning the language. And indeed, it also points to a lack of integration at the beginning of persons who arrive here. But I think it's very important to bear in mind that in the results, we don't only see recent arrival. The largest part of the people with the foreign origins are actually second or even third generation migrants. So that means that even for people who have grown up here, of whom we would hope that they have had more or less the same background, they still repeat grades more often. This could, of course, also be due to the fact that their parents aren't always very well versed in Dutch or French. And then I think the example that Veerle gave of the French briefcase could also be very helpful, even for second generation migrants. Oh, and Patrick has also responded to the second question in the chat. Thank you very much, Patrick. And the final question, it would be interesting to know the age of migrants by level of study. So we could definitely, in theory, get this kind of data. We haven't included this as such in the report, but administrative data does make this possible. So we could look in the future to see if we can include this in our statistical annex. Are there any other questions? We still have 5 minutes, so don't hold back if you have a remark, a question, or thoughts on how to proceed. Aha, so Elizabeth from Duo for a Job has a question for Veerle and myself. And the question is, if you'd have to give a very short answer on the question, why does Belgium have the largest employment gap in Europe? What would that short answer be? That's a very good question. I'll see if Veerle has an immediate response. And maybe Tom can also think if he has a response.
Well, I would say that it's a combination of factors. Unfortunately, education is a big element of that, right? So if I have to pick one, then I would say education. But it's definitely more. It's many structural factors that also influence and then also language. I mean, half of Belgium is Dutch. Dutch-speaking language, certainly not helping migrants integration. But yeah, we have two Belgian experts here, so I leave the word to them.
Tom, any thoughts?
I think I would also have mentioned education first, but that's a bit too easy coming from labor market policymakers, of course, to blame it all on education. So I think the fact that our labor market is very difficult to exceed anyway is an important factor. We see also that for people, for the low skilled, we are doing even worse than for people from foreign origin. So we just have a labor market where it's not easy to get into it, and once you're into it, your career is complicated by this segmentation. It's not easy to get into the labor market, and once you're in the labor market, it's not easy to go into a better job for many people. This, of course, this doesn't go for everyone, because otherwise nobody would be working, which is obviously not the case. But we have a difficult labor market.
I think if I may ask also, because the question here is like employment gap, is this specifically for young people or for the total population? Because I think there we're looking at two different. But we're looking at two different issues, right? Because if we're looking at the total employment rate, we're mostly talking about the difficult integration of older workers and especially older women, where here education is not the issue. It's really very much how do we get migrant or women with a foreign background into the labor market. Whereas if we're talking about young people, I also think there's a huge regional diversity. And here again, then we're talking about very specific issues, like, for example, the integration of young people with a migrant background in, let's say, Brussels, where the employment gap is enormous.
Although we're probably still suffering from the education gap that was already there 20 and to 30 years ago. This inequality in education must have existed before the OECD started doing PISA studies.
Yeah, now, I've given myself the most time to think, of course. So what I suspect that maybe up until now, like things just weren't that bad. So one thing is that when you're on the labor market, your labor market conditions in Belgium, working conditions are quite good. So for people who are already insiders, they just like to keep their job. On the other hand, we've not often been in a situation with a very big labor market tightness. Well, not after we looked for people to employ in the mines in the 60s and things like that, but afterwards things were quite well, everything worked out, so we were never forced to think outside of the box. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why employers are still looking for a sort of perfect candidate for each job, someone with the exact degree, who speaks the same language, who maybe even grew up in the same village. Like, this is someone you know. And I think in Belgium, we've rarely come to the point where we really have to start thinking, how do we include everyone? So it's also a mindset where you think like we need to get everyone on the labor market if they want to participate, and we really need everyone. So I'm kind of hoping to end on a positive note that increasing labor market tightness can actually lead us to include more unusual candidates, in the sense of ones who do not resemble the employers that are already on our labor market. But of course, that's a bit of wishful thinking. So it's now 12.
Let me maybe just add, reacting to, because in the chat some people rightly point out that of course discrimination plays an important role, and I don't think we can deny that. What I think is particular for Belgium is that discrimination here comes together with a system where its impact is huge, because you already have this, well, because of how our education system works, because how our labor market works. Probably discrimination here has an even higher impact than the same level of discrimination would have in other countries.
So there was one more question. Eliza and Vele, do you still have time for a final question?
Sure.
So then I will give the floor, but I think the hand has now disappeared. So someone was raising their hand, but I
Yes,
cannot
it was
see it
me. Sorry, I was just trying to respond to what you were saying about the labor market shortage, that it could bring more inclusivity on the labor market. But I would like to warn especially about labor market segmentation, because yes, indeed, we could have more inclusivity, but it will also maybe how do you say, make that some people will be always pushed by to certain sectors and certain jobs that are maybe less quality, that have less quality than others, and that it's specific groups that will go to specific jobs. So a bit of warning that I think you're right, there would be more inclusivity, but there would be also more labor market segmentation.
Yeah, excellent point. And I think, again, the crises that we have show that every progress we make is also very precarious. So we take some steps in the right direction, but we very quickly lose our advantage as soon as a crisis occurs, or the economy is doing a bit less. So I will end here. Thank you very much to all speakers. Thank you also to the participants. And again, we will put the recorded version of this webinar on our website in a couple of days. So that's it. Have a very nice day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.